Hello again. In this video, we are going to talk about chunking. Now, chunking is a new term to this program. I haven't necessarily used that term before. It's something that is common in English pronunciation and fluency training, referred to commonly. I have described it in other ways, such as linking and pausing and connecting words together. But I think this idea of chunking is important to be able to look at those concepts in a new way and to have a new way to kind of structure the way that we're grouping words together in our sentences, in our presentations, things like that. So I think this idea of chunking is going to be very helpful for you to identify which words to stress and how to link words together. So let's get started. So first of all, what is chunking? So let me describe what chunking is. Chunking is creating chunks in your message that are separated by a pause or a change in tone. So that's very important. It can be a pause or it can be just a change in tone. And I'll describe that and I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit. So creating chunks or groups in our words and sentences, or in our sentences and in our presentations that are separated by these pauses and changes in tone. So that's very important to kind of think about. All right, these chunks, they give, speaking this way, speaking in chunks with the pausing and the change of tone really gives variety to your speaking voice, okay? It gives variety to your voice and allows your listener to be more engaged in it. It also helps your listener to really understand what you're saying. It's much, much easier for your listener to understand when you're using those pauses and that change of tone and using these chunks effectively. Okay, very important for non-native English speakers to learn how to use this concept well. All right, so for example, let me show you kind of an example of not using chunking effectively and then using chunking effectively. So in terms of not using effectively, here are some things that I tend to hear from my students or just even other speakers. It doesn't even have to be a non-native English speaker, but I find that people tend to fall into this mistake when they're giving presentations very frequently. Okay, so the first one is to kind of have just this boring tone that's the same throughout. Okay, so that would sound like, today I'd like to talk to you about a concept called chunking. Chunking is a strategy that great speakers use very effectively. It sounds effortless, but in fact it takes a lot of practice. So really low pitch, very, same tone throughout. Not a lot of pausing or breaks in between sentences or in between these chunks, just kind of boring, okay? Another thing that I see, especially with my students, is creating too many breaks, okay? Too many, separating those chunks too frequently. So that would sound like, today I'd like to talk to you about a concept called chunking. Chunking is a strategy that great speakers use very effectively. It sounds effortless, but in fact, it takes a lot of practice, okay? So that's an example of just cutting it up too much, having too many breaks within that thought or within that presentation, okay? So we need to find a balance there. We need to find what will work to vary and to break things up, but not too much and not too little. Okay, so I have 4 steps here that we can go through to identify, to really use this idea of chunking effectively. Okay, number 1, identify the chunks. Where do the breaks need to be? Okay, so I have this paragraph here, and I want you to use your worksheet that I've given. Download that worksheet, have it in front of you, and I want you to create some slash marks where you think that in between the words, words that you think need to be broken up. So where are those chunks in the sentence. So if you need to, in this paragraph, if you need to pause the video and create those and kind of figure out where those chunks would be, then go ahead and do that. I guess what I should probably do first, so let me do this first. Let me speak it using let me read it using the chunks, and then based on that, identify where the chunks should be. So let me give you that example. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a concept called chunking. Chunking is a strategy that great speakers use very effectively. It sounds effortless, but in fact, it takes a lot of practice. So I'll do it one more time so you can hear that, but I really want you to identify where am I pausing and where am I changing my tone to create a different chunk in that paragraph. All right, ready? Today, I'd like to talk to you about a concept called chunking. Chunking is a strategy that great speakers use very effectively. It sounds effortless, but in fact, it takes a lot of practice. All right, so identify those chunks. One thing to be aware of is a chunk doesn't have to be where a punctuation is. So it doesn't have to have a comma or a period to create that chunk. It can be in between two words in a sentence that doesn't have a punctuation in it. So pause the video, identify where you think those chunks are, and we'll go over the answers in a minute. Okay, so let's go ahead and identify those chunks. Okay, so this is where I was breaking or changing my tone. So today, I'd like to talk to you about a concept called chunking. Chunking is a strategy that great speakers use very effectively. It sounds effortless, but in fact, it takes a lot of practice. Okay, so I've broken that paragraph up in those ways. Those slashes indicate where the break, either there was a slight pause or a change in tone. Okay, so check on your worksheet. How did you do? Were you able to identify those chunks or not?